Hello everyone on the channel. My name is Carlos, and I've been a truck driver for 20 years. Throughout all these years on the road, there's one story that has never left my mind. It happened about 5 years ago on a rainy night during a trip to Londrina. That night, I had just picked up a heavy load and knew the journey would be long and complicated. Serra do Mar is already treacherous under normal conditions, but that night it was worse. The rain was pouring heavily, and thick fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. I turned on my fog lights and slowed down, trying to keep the truck stable on the tight curves. The windshield wipers were on maximum, but they seemed futile against the downpour. Tall, dense trees around the road heightened the feeling of isolation. I was tired, but I had to keep going. I remembered a story I had heard from other truck drivers about that road, how dangerous it could be, especially on rainy nights. Some even spoke of strange accidents that had occurred there, but I always thought they were just urban legends. As I drove, I heard the constant sound of rain hitting the windshield, the roar of the engine, and the tires gripping the wet road. Occasionally, I passed through small villages or gas stations, but most of the time it was just me, the road, and the darkness. It was well past midnight when I started descending a steeper stretch of the mountain. The truck was heavy, and each curve demanded my full attention. I had to focus to avoid sliding or losing control. Then, in the sharpest and most treacherous curve of the stretch, I saw a figure on the shoulder. A woman dressed in white, completely drenched by the rain, stood there motionless, seemingly staring at me as I approached. My first reaction was pure shock. My heart raced and I almost lost control of the truck. I looked away for a second to regain control, and when I looked back, she was still there, like a statue. I pulled over a bit ahead with the intention of helping her. Something told me she needed help. I got out of the truck, but when I reached the spot where I had seen her, there was no one there. The road was deserted, and the only sounds were those of rain and wind. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I decided to go back to the truck and continue my journey, but the image of that woman stayed in my mind. I returned to the cabin, started the engine again, and resumed driving. The feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone, and I didn't know that would be just the first of many strange experiences that night. After returning to the truck, I tried to put the incident behind me and focus on the road, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The atmosphere inside the cabin was strange, heavy. I turned on the radio to try to distract myself, but the music didn't help much. The road seemed increasingly deserted. The more I drove, the more I felt like something or someone was with me. Suddenly, I began to hear a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the back seat. It was a whisper, a kind of murmuring. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but I didn't see anything unusual. The sense of presence grew stronger. I looked at the passenger seat and was shocked. For a brief moment, I saw the silhouette of the woman in white sitting there, wet and with her eyes fixed on me. I blinked, and she disappeared. My heart raced and adrenaline surged through me. It was becoming difficult to stay calm and focused on driving. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The road, the rain, the fatigue, all of it could be playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers continued, becoming clearer. They seemed to say my name, Carlos, repeatedly, in a hauntingly melodic manner. With every curve, every kilometer, the tension increased. I constantly looked in the mirrors, hoping to see something, but the road was empty. I decided to accelerate a bit, hoping to reach a gas station or any place with people soon. It was then on a sharper curve that I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. A chill ran down my spine, and my body tensed up. I quickly looked at the passenger seat, and there she was again, the woman in white, with empty eyes and an expression of despair. I screamed and turned the steering wheel abruptly, almost veering off the road. The truck skidded, but I managed to regain control. The woman had vanished again, but now I was certain it wasn't just my imagination. I pulled over to the shoulder, trying to catch my breath and understand what was happening. My hands trembled, and my mind was in turmoil. The rain continued to fall heavily, and the fog seemed even thicker. I thought about calling someone for help, but what excuse would I give? "Hi, I'm seeing ghosts on the road." No one would believe me. I took a deep breath and decided to continue, despite all the fear and tension. I shifted gears and returned to the road, more alert than ever. The journey was still long, and I just wanted to reach my destination and leave that cursed mountain behind, but the feeling of being followed, watched, wouldn't leave me in peace. Every kilometer, the whisper returned, louder, clearer. "Carlos." I knew that trip would be one of the longest and most terrifying of my life, and I could hardly wait to leave it all behind. Finally, after what felt like hours of endless tension, I saw the lights of a restaurant in the distance. It was one of those places that are open 24 hours, popular among truck drivers. I felt immense relief at seeing movement and people. I parked the truck and practically jumped out of the cabin, still with my heart racing. Entered the restaurant, and the smell of fresh coffee and hot food calmed me a little. The place was relatively full, with several truck drivers chatting at their tables. I found a quiet corner, sat down, and ordered a coffee. As I waited, I looked around, trying to push away the feeling that I was still being watched. That's when I noticed a group of truck drivers looking in my direction. One of them, a robust man with graying beard, approached me. "Are you okay, friend?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half jokingly, half seriously. I took a deep breath and, despite my apprehension, decided to tell them what had happened. I spoke about the woman in white in the curve, the whispers in the truck, and the constant feeling of being watched. When I finished, I expected laughter or skeptical looks, but to my surprise, the faces around me were serious. "You're not the first to see that woman," said the bearded man. "We've heard this story before. Many who pass through that road at night end up seeing her." Another truck driver, a younger guy with a worn-out cap, added, "They say she's the spirit of a woman who died in an accident on that curve many years ago. Locals call her the woman of the curve. The problem," continued the older truck driver, "is that many who see her end up being involved in some accident afterward, as if she's warning or worse, attracting misfortune." I felt a chill down my spine hearing that. "What should I do?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Pray, my friend," said the older man. "Pray and stay alert. Avoid driving on that road at night if you can, and if it happens again, don't panic. Stay strong and don't lose control." I stayed a while longer in the restaurant, talking to the truck drivers and trying to absorb everything they had told me. Despite the lingering fear, their company gave me some courage. I ordered a meal, had another coffee, and after a while I felt a little better, but I knew I had to get back on the road. My destination was Curitiba, and I couldn't stay there forever. With their words of advice in my mind and a silent prayer, I returned to the truck. The night was still dark and rainy, but I felt a little more prepared to face whatever came next. I shifted gears, turned on the radio at a low volume just to have some company and break the eerie silence of the night. To my surprise and relief, the journey continued without further incidents. The feeling of being watched gradually faded, and the whispers didn't return. The presence I felt in the truck seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the constant sound of rain and the hum of the engine. After a few hours, I finally saw the lights on the horizon. A mix of relief and exhaustion washed over me. When I arrived at my destination and parked the truck, a heavy weight lifted off my shoulders. I was safe and far from that cursed road. Since that day, whenever I have to drive through Serra do Mar, I avoid driving at night. The experience left its mark on me, but also made me more cautious. I continue to pray, asking for protection on every journey, and grateful for having overcome that night without major problems. Today, 5 years after that incident, I'm still on the roads driving my truck, and thank God I've never had any accidents, like those truck drivers said those who saw the woman on the curve had. The story ends here, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this tale from my life as a truck driver. Remember, the roads can hold many mysteries and dangers, so always stay alert and cautious. Thank you for listening, and until next time. My name is Jake Thompson. I am a 16-year-old American teenager living in Seattle, Washington. I am an only child of dedicated parents who have always given me a lot of support to explore my passions and interests. Currently, I am in high school, excelling in science and mathematics, subjects in which I have a notable talent. I lead a simple life like any other young person my age, but everything began to change on a cloudy autumn afternoon. The orange and yellow leaves formed a blanket on the sidewalk in our quiet suburban street. The routine of my simple life was about to change, but I didn't know it yet. My parents were at work, and I was returning from school, thinking about solving some physics problems that the teacher had given us. The air was fresh and humid, with the smell of wet earth after the recent rain. As I walked home, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of the house next to ours. The house had been empty for months since the previous residents moved to Florida. Curious, I stopped for a moment to watch. The truck was loaded with old furniture and boxes marked with time-worn labels. A tall man with gray hair and a stern face was unloading boxes. He wore a grim expression that made me shiver. Beside him, a boy my age, pale and with eyes that seemed too tired for someone so young, helped with the smaller boxes. Our eyes met for an instant, and I felt a chill down my spine. There was something unsettling about that boy, something I couldn't identify, but that left me deeply uncomfortable. Later, That night when I told my parents about our new neighbors, they seemed relieved. "It's good that someone finally moved into that house," my dad said, trying to sound optimistic. My mom, always curious, asked what the new residents were like, and I described the stern man and the pale boy. "Maybe they're just tired from the move," she suggested. Days passed and I began to notice strange things. The first time I really felt that something was wrong was one night when I was studying at my desk. My bedroom window faced the new boy's room. I saw a dim light through his curtains, but what really caught my attention was a shadowy figure that seemed to be watching from the window. I thought it might be him, but there was something unnatural about that shadow, something that filled me with a cold dread. The figure was tall and slender, with indistinct contours, and seemed to move in an eerily fluid manner. The next day, I decided to talk to the boy. During a break at school, I found him in the hallway and introduced myself. His name was David. When I asked about the figure in the window, he became pale and nervous, muttering something about not knowing what I was talking about. But there was fear in his eyes, a fear he couldn't hide. I asked more about him and his father, but David shut down even more, looking around as if expecting someone to be listening. One night I woke up to a strange noise. It was a rhythmic sound, like someone was lightly tapping on my window. I looked at the clock, 3:33 a.m. I cautiously approached the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the shadowy figure was there again, clearer than ever, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It was closer this time, almost pressed against the glass. Before I could react, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the darkness as if it had never been there. The following nights were filled with nightmares and strange sounds. Footsteps, whispers, and knocking continued to torment me. I told my parents, but they thought it was just stress from school. "You're doing so well in your classes, Jake. Maybe you need a little rest," they said. Despite their advice, the fear and anxiety only grew. I woke up multiple times during the night, feeling like I was being watched. I decided to investigate on my own. I waited for a quiet night and snuck out of the house, heading to David's house. I found an unlocked window and entered. The house was cold and dark, with a strange smell of mold. I heard a low sound like muffled crying. I followed the sound to a room upstairs. Each step I took seemed to echo off the empty walls, and the sense of dread increased with every moment. When I opened the door, a chill ran down my spine. The scene before me was terrifying. David was sitting on the floor, surrounded by candles casting a flickering and sinister light. The smell of melted wax mixed with a metallic, nauseating odor emanating from the walls, covered in strange and disturbing symbols painted with something that looked like fresh blood. David was crying, his tears reflecting the candlelight, while murmuring words in an unknown language, each syllable laden with despair. I tried to call out to him, but my voice came out weak and trembling. He saw me, and with eyes wide with pure terror screamed for me to get out. Before I could react, a shadowy figure materialized in the corner of the room. This time, its form was more defined, revealing grotesque and distorted features. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a mask of hatred and malice, with deep black eyes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. The candles flickered violently, casting shadows that seemed to come to life, dancing on the walls and ceiling in a macabre ballet. The figure advanced, and an excruciating pain exploded in my chest, as if an invisible hand was crushing my heart. I could barely breathe, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. In a last effort of survival, I managed to run out, the sound of heavy, shadowy footsteps chasing me. I locked myself in my room, my heart pounding against my ribs, cold sweat dripping down my face. I tried to call. The ensuing silence was deafening, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. The next morning, the house was strangely quiet. David and his father had vanished without a trace. The rooms were empty, the walls clean, as if the horrifying scene of the previous night had never happened. The police, called in a hurry, found no clues, only the remains of the candles and an oppressive sense of despair. When I reported what had happened, the officers looked at me with skepticism, attributing everything to my fertile imagination and stress. However, I knew the truth. The shadowy figure, the malevolent entity, was still with me. The nights became a constant torment. At 3:33 a.m., always the same time, I felt its presence, a cold chill settling in the room, paralyzing me with fear. My life changed irrevocably. Fear became my constant companion, the feeling of being watched, an inescapable reality. I tried to move forward, but the memory of that night and the unspeakable horror I witnessed never leave me. I know there are things in this world that are better left hidden, and unfortunately I discovered this in the worst possible way. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Harrison, and I am a 38-year-old software engineer born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. From a young age, I always demonstrated a passion for technology and innovation, which led me to pursue a career in software development. I graduated in computer science from the University of Illinois, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the state. I would like to share with you a terrifying experience I had with my family during a trip. It is something that still gives me chills just thinking about it. It was a Friday night, and my wife Karen, our 2 children, Emily and Michael, and I were excited for a weekend trip. We decided to rent an isolated cabin in the mountains, a perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city and enjoy some nature. The road to the cabin was winding and surrounded by dense forests. The night was dark, moonless, and the only light came from our car's headlights. The GPS directed us onto a secondary road, saying it was a shortcut, but we soon began to feel lost. There was no cell phone signal, and the tall trees blocked any view of the sky. As we progressed, the road narrowed, and the branches of the trees scraped against the car, creating a disturbing sound. Emily and Michael were in the back seat, whispering to each other, clearly nervous about the situation. Karen, beside me, held my arm tightly, trying to hide her fear. After almost an hour of driving on this deserted road, we finally spotted the cabin in the distance, a small wooden structure with dim lights illuminating the porch. The relief was palpable, but mixed with a sense of discomfort we couldn't explain. We parked the car and began unloading the bags. The silence around us was oppressive, interrupted only by the distant sounds of the forest. When we entered the cabin, a wave of cold enveloped us, despite the heater being on. The decor was rustic, with old wooden furniture and an unlit fireplace in the corner of the room. We tried to settle in and forget the strangeness of our arrival. Karen prepared something for us to eat while the children explored the rooms. The night went by quietly until around 10 o'clock. The first signs of something wrong began to appear. We were all in the living room talking and playing cards when we heard a noise coming from upstairs. Karen suggested it might be rats, but something about the sound was different, like the dragging of something very heavy. It sounded like furniture being dragged, heavy and insistent. I looked at Karen, who was pale, and asked the children to stay in the living room while I checked. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, and shadows danced on the walls. When we went to sleep, the noises intensified. It was as if something or someone was walking down the hallway on the second floor. I got up to check but found nothing. However, I felt a strange chill, a sensation that we were not alone. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a disturbing sound, the laughter of a child. My heart raced, and I looked at Karen, who was also awake and pale with fear. We went to the children's room, but they were both sound asleep. The laughter continued, echoing throughout the house. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We tried to ignore the sounds, but it was impossible. Each noise seemed louder and closer. I felt a shiver down my spine when I heard a whisper near my ear, even though I was lying in bed next to Karen. We then decided to explore the attic, which was the only place we had not checked. The stairs leading to the attic were narrow and creaked with each step we took. The air up there was dense, and a feeling of discomfort took over me. The attic was full of dust and old things. In the farthest corner, we found an old porcelain doll with a sinister look and cracks on its face. As soon as I approached, the doll fell off the shelf on its own, as if it had been pushed. From that moment on, the situation worsened. The doll began to appear in different parts of the house, even after we tried to get rid of it. One day, we woke up to find the doll sitting on the living room couch, its head turned directly toward the kitchen, where Karen was preparing. The tension in the house increased every day. One night, while we were trying to sleep, we heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs and approaching our room. The door slowly opened, and there was the doll, standing in the hallway, watching us with its empty, cold eyes. I got up to grab it, but before I could reach it, the doll moved on its own, sliding back and disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. The next day, I called a friend who was an expert in paranormal phenomena, Carlos, who had long been dedicated to investigating the supernatural. He arrived with his equipment and began inspecting the house. While adjusting his devices in the attic, an inexplicable cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing all the candles and plunging the environment into oppressive darkness. The ensuing silence was deadly, laden with almost palpable tension. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening scream echoed through the house, chilling my blood. We ran to the attic, finding Carlos on the floor with the porcelain doll beside him. Gripped by deep fear and a sense of urgency, we decided. We went to an old church in the neighboring town, whose stone walls seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. The priest, a man with a severe countenance and wise eyes, listened to our story attentively. He advised us to perform an exorcism ceremony before burying it to ensure the spirit was imprisoned. During the ceremony, the atmosphere inside the church seemed to close in around us. The doll, placed on an improvised altar, began to tremble violently. The sound it emitted was low and continuous, a murmur of anger and despair that chilled every fiber of my being. The priest recited prayers in Latin, his voice firm but laden with an urgency that could not be ignored. As the ceremony progressed, the air around us grew dense, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with a malevolent presence. The porcelain doll began to crack, fine lines spreading across its face, as if the spirit inside was trying to escape. In a moment of absolute terror, the doll raised its head on its own and looked directly at us, its eyes glowing with an intense and diabolical light. Finally, at the climax of the ceremony, the priest sprinkled holy water over the doll, and a horrific scream reverberated through the air, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell. The doll calmed down, its tremors ceased, and the light in its eyes gradually faded. With the doll now seemingly inert, we took it to the cemetery adjacent to the church. The ground was damp and cold, and a low mist covered the ground, creating an even more sinister atmosphere. We dug a deep grave and, with trembling hands, placed the doll inside. As soon as the earth began to cover the doll, we felt an immediate relief, as if an immense weight had been lifted from our shoulders. In a moment of absence, the following nights were silent and peaceful. The noises ceased, and the feeling of discomfort disappeared. However, occasionally, when the house is quiet and dark, I still feel as if something or someone is watching us. And on stormy nights, if we listen closely, we can hear a faint, distant laugh, as if the doll is waiting for its next victim. This incident left deep marks on our souls, a grim reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding that inhabit this world, ready to manifest when we least expect it.